I never thought a community garden would lead me to uncover the biggest scandal in our neighborhood's history. But there I was, standing in front of the county zoning office with a stack of documents that would bring the entire Pine Ridge HOA to its knees. My name is Walter Garrison, and I had lived in Pine Ridge Estates in Boulder County, Colorado, for about 3 years when this whole mess started. I worked as an environmental consultant for a private firm, which meant I spent most of my days reviewing impact assessments and making sure construction projects did not destroy the local ecosystem. It was boring work most of the time, but it paid well and let me live in a nice subdivision with mountain views and walking trails. What I did not know was that those very trails and the pristine wetlands behind our neighborhood were about to become the center of a battle that would expose corruption, fraud, and environmental crimes that reached all the way to the state capitol. It started on a Tuesday morning in late March. I was drinking my coffee on the back deck when I noticed orange survey markers scattered across the wetland preserve behind my house. The preserve was supposed to be protected land, part of the reason property values in Pine Ridge were so high. People paid premium prices to back up to protected open space. I grabbed my binoculars and saw construction equipment parked near the tree line, along with several people in hard hats examining the terrain. My gut told me something was wrong. I finished my coffee, got dressed, and walked down to the preserve entrance. A large sign had been erected overnight. It read, "Future site of Pine Ridge Community Center and Recreational Facility. Construction begins May 2026. Pine Ridge HOA Development Project." I stood there reading that sign 3 times, my confusion growing with each pass. Nobody had mentioned anything about construction in the preserve at any HOA meeting. I attended them religiously because I had learned early on that HOAs could be sneaky, and missing a meeting often meant getting blindsided by some new rule or fee. But a community center, in protected wetlands, that made no sense at all. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who had served on the HOA board until he resigned last year over what he called ethical differences with the president. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring. "Walter, what's up? Did you know the HOA is planning to build a community center in the wetland preserve?" There was a long pause. "What? No, that is impossible. That land has environmental protections. The whole development was approved 20 years ago with the explicit condition that the wetlands remain untouched." Well, someone forgot to tell the construction crew. There are survey markers everywhere and a big sign announcing the project. Marcus cursed under his breath. "This has Brenda written all over it. She has been pushing for a community center since she became HOA president 2 years ago. But there is no way she got the permits for that. The environmental review alone would take years." Brenda Carmichael. Of course. Our HOA president was a 52-year-old former real estate agent who treated the homeowners association like her personal fiefdom. She had short blonde hair that she kept in that distinctive "can I speak to the manager" style, drove a white Escalade, and had a voice that could shatter glass when she was angry, which was often. She had made my life miserable over everything from my mailbox being the wrong shade of black to my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. "I am going to look into this," I told Marcus. "Something does not add up." "Be careful," he warned. "Brenda does not like people questioning her authority." Ask me how I know. I hung up and walked back home, but I could not shake the feeling that something seriously wrong was happening. As an environmental consultant, I knew exactly how complicated it was to get permits for construction near protected wetlands. The process involved multiple environmental impact studies, public hearings, state and federal reviews, and usually took a minimum of 2 to 3 years. There was no way the HOA had done all that without anyone knowing. That afternoon, I drove to the Boulder County Planning and Zoning Office. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Sandra, pulled up the records for Pine Ridge Estates on her computer. "What can I help you find?" she asked. "I need to see any development permits issued for the Pine Ridge HOA in the last 3 years, particularly anything involving the wetland preserve area." Sandra typed for a moment, then frowned. "I am showing a permit application submitted 8 months ago for a community recreational facility. It was approved 6 weeks ago." My stomach dropped. "Approved? Can I see the documentation?" She printed out several pages and handed them to me. I scanned through them quickly, my professional eye catching problems immediately. The environmental impact assessment was only 12 pages long. A legitimate assessment for wetland construction should have been easily over 100 pages. The study had been conducted by a company I had never heard of, Green Solutions Environmental Consulting, based in Denver. "Can I get copies of the complete permit file, including all environmental studies?" I asked. "Sure, but it will be about 200 pages. Cost you $40 for copying." "That is fine." While Sandra prepared the copies, I pulled out my phone and searched for Green Solutions Environmental Consulting. Their website looked professional enough, but something felt off. The staff page showed only 3 people, and their projects section listed mostly minor residential work. Nothing that would qualify them to assess wetland impacts for a major construction project. I paid for the copies and drove home with a growing sense of unease. Once I got back to my house, I spread everything out on my dining room table and started reading. What I found made my blood run cold. The environmental impact study was a joke. It claimed the wetland area contained minimal ecological value, and that construction would have negligible impact on local wildlife and water systems. Anyone with basic environmental training could see this was nonsense. The Pine Ridge wetlands were home to several protected species, including the problem meadow jumping mouse, which was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The wetlands also served as a crucial buffer for Boulder Creek, filtering runoff and preventing flooding in the area. But here is what really got me. The study claimed that soil samples had been taken and analyzed, but provided no actual data. It mentioned a hydrological survey, but included no maps or measurements. It was all vague assertions with no supporting evidence. This was not just bad science. This was fraud. I called Marcus again. "I need you to look at something. Can you come over?" He arrived 20 minutes later and I showed him everything. He read through the documents with increasingly wide eyes. "This is insane," he said finally. "This environmental study is completely fabricated. And look at this." He pointed to a signature page. "The county environmental review officer who signed off on this is Robert Paulson. I know Bob. He retired 9 months ago and moved to Arizona. There is no way he approved this." So someone forged his signature, looks like it, or they pushed this through right before he left and he did not bother to actually review it. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. We need to report this. If they start construction and damage those wetlands, the ecological harm could take decades to repair. Report it to who? Brenda basically owns the county zoning board chair. They play tennis together. Then we go over their heads, state level. The Colorado Department of Natural Resources handles wetland protections, and if there is evidence of fraud, we might need to involve law enforcement. Marcus nodded slowly. "You realize Brenda is going to make your life hell, right? She has deep pockets and a lot of connections." "Then it is a good thing I have receipts," I said. tapping the stack of documents. The next morning, I drafted a detailed complaint to the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, outlining all the problems with the environmental study and the permit approval process. I included copies of the relevant documents and a professional analysis highlighting the specific deficiencies in the assessment. I also noted the presence of protected species in the area and the potential violations of both state and federal environmental laws. I submitted the complaint through the official state portal and sent additional copies via certified mail. Then, I filed a separate complaint with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation regarding potential permit fraud and forgery. While I waited for responses, I decided to do more digging. I requested public records from the HOA regarding the community center project. Colorado law required HOAs to maintain certain records and make them available to homeowners. Brenda was going to hate this, but legally she had to comply. I sent the formal request via email and certified mail, asking for all meeting minutes, financial records, and communications related to the community center project. The HOA had 15 days to respond. Brenda called me 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was exactly what I expected. Saccharine sweet at first, then increasingly hostile. Walter, this is Brenda Carmichael, your HOA president. I received your records request, and I am frankly appalled at your hostile attitude toward this community improvement project. The community center will benefit all residents and increase our property values significantly. Your obstructionist behavior is noted and will be addressed. I expect you to withdraw your request immediately. Call me back. I did not call her back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to Marcus with a note. Here we go. A week later, I received a formal response to my records request. The HOA claimed that most of the documents I requested were privileged or not applicable to my inquiry. They provided only minimal information, a few heavily redacted meeting minutes, and a vague budget line item showing $2.3 million allocated for community improvements. This was a clear violation of Colorado law. HOAs had to provide detailed financial records to homeowners, especially regarding major expenditures. I filed a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which had oversight authority over HOAs in the state. 2 weeks after I filed my complaint with the Department of Natural Resources, I got a call from a woman named Patricia Morrison, a senior environmental compliance officer with the state. Mr. Garrison, I have reviewed your complaint regarding the Pine Ridge development permit. I have to say, your analysis is extremely thorough. Are you an environmental professional? Yes, I work as an environmental consultant for Clearwater Associates here in Boulder. That explains the quality of your submission. I have serious concerns about this permit. The environmental study you flagged appears to be severely deficient, and we have confirmed that Robert Paulson, whose signature appears on the approval documents, was no longer employed by Boulder County at the time the permit was allegedly approved. My heart rate picked up. So what happens now? I am opening a formal investigation. As of today, I am issuing a stop work order on the Pine Ridge development project pending completion of our review. If our investigation confirms your findings, the permit will be revoked and the responsible parties may face criminal charges. Thank you, I said. I was worried this would get buried. Not a chance. Environmental fraud is taken very seriously, especially when it involves protected wetlands and endangered species habitats. You did the right thing reporting this. After we hung up, I felt a wave of relief. But I also knew the storm was about to hit. The stop work order was delivered to the HOA the next day. Brenda called an emergency meeting for that evening. I made sure to attend. The community center meeting room was packed. Word had spread quickly about the state investigation, and homeowners wanted answers. I took a seat in the back, trying to stay inconspicuous. Brenda stood at the front of the room, her face flushed red. Next to her sat the other board members. Treasurer Ronald Hayes, a balding accountant in his 60s. Secretary Linda Foster, a timid woman who always looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. And at-large member Gregory Hunt, a lawyer who I suspected was involved in drafting whatever legal documents had gotten the HOA into this mess. I want to start by addressing the malicious lies being spread about our community center project, Brenda began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. A disgruntled homeowner has filed frivolous complaints with various state agencies in an attempt to block this valuable community improvement. These baseless accusations have resulted in an unwarranted stop work order that is costing our community thousands of dollars in delays. Several people in the crowd murmured. I noticed some of them glancing back at me. Apparently, word had spread about who filed the complaints. The HOA board has worked tirelessly to bring this project to fruition, Brenda continued. We followed all proper procedures and obtained all necessary permits. The fact that some pencil pusher at the state level has decided to second-guess the county's approval is not our fault. I raised my hand. I have a question. Brenda's eyes locked onto me like a missile acquiring a target. Mr. Garrison, how nice of you to join us. Can you explain why the environmental impact study for this project was only 12 pages long when a legitimate wetland assessment should be well over 100 pages? The study was prepared by licensed professionals and approved by the county. That is all you need to know. Can you tell us who Green Solutions Environmental Consulting is? Because I cannot find any record of them completing any major environmental assessments. Brenda's face got redder. I do not have to explain our contractor selection process to you. Actually, under Colorado law you do, I said calmly. HOA members have the right to review all contracts and expenditures, especially for a $2.3 million project. I submitted a proper records request, and you provided almost nothing. That is a violation of state statute. Gregory Hunt, the lawyer, leaned forward. Mr. Garrison, your records request is being reviewed. We have the right to withhold certain privileged information. Financial records for a community construction project are not privileged, I shot back. And the fact that you are stonewalling suggests you have something to hide. The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Other homeowners started asking questions, demanding to see the environmental study, wanting to know why they had not been properly informed about the project. Brenda tried to regain control, but the meeting had descended into chaos. Finally, Brenda slammed her gavel. This meeting is adjourned. The board will be consulting with our attorneys regarding Mr. Garrison's harassment and obstruction. Further announcements will be forthcoming. She stormed out, with the other board members trailing behind her. I stayed in my seat as homeowners came up to talk to me. Some thanked me for raising questions. Others accused me of causing trouble. One elderly woman named Dorothy told me she had been worried about the wetlands but was afraid to speak up because Brenda had threatened her with fines over a garden gnome that supposedly violated HOA aesthetic guidelines. She rules this place like a dictator, Dorothy said quietly. Someone needed to stand up to her. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I received a notice from the HOA citing me for 17 separate violations. My grass was too long, my mailbox was dented, my house numbers were faded, my driveway had oil stains, my fence needed repainting, and on and on. Each violation carried a $50 daily fine. The total potential fines added up to thousands of dollars. It was obvious harassment, and I documented everything carefully. I took time-stamped photos showing that most of the alleged violations did not actually exist. My grass was perfectly maintained, my mailbox was fine, my house numbers had just been repainted 6 months ago. This was Brenda's attempt to bully me into backing down. Instead, I filed another complaint, this time with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, detailing the retaliatory enforcement actions. I also hired a real estate attorney named Susan Rodriguez who specialized in HOA disputes. "This is textbook retaliation," Susan told me during our first meeting. HOAs are not allowed to selectively enforce rules to punish homeowners for exercising their legal rights. We can fight this. While my personal battle with the HOA intensified, the state investigation was moving forward. Patricia Morrison contacted me several times, asking for additional information and clarification on various points. She told me they had sent investigators to examine the wetlands in person and were conducting their own environmental assessment. "The more we dig, the worse this looks," she said during one call. "We have found evidence of at least 3 protected species in the wetlands, including the problem meadow jumping mouse you mentioned. The original environmental study claimed no protected species were present. That is either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud. What about Green Solutions Environmental Consulting? Did you track them down? That is where things get really interesting. The company exists on paper, but it is essentially a shell. It was incorporated 18 months ago, and the registered agent is a lawyer in Denver who specializes in setting up corporate entities. We are working on piercing the corporate veil to find out who is really behind it." "You think someone in the HOA set up a fake environmental consulting company to rubber stamp their project?" "That is exactly what I think, and if we can prove it, we are looking at multiple felonies." In mid-May, the state completed its investigation. Patricia Morrison called me with the results. "Mr. Garrison, I wanted you to hear this directly from me before it becomes public. The Colorado Department of Natural Resources is revoking the development permit for the Pine Ridge Community Center project, effective immediately. Our investigation found that the environmental impact study was fraudulent. The permit approval process was compromised through forgery, and the project would cause significant and irreparable harm to protected wetlands and endangered species habitat." I felt a surge of vindication. "That is excellent news. There is more. We have referred the matter to the Boulder County District Attorney for criminal prosecution. We have evidence that Brenda Carmichael personally contracted with Green Solutions Environmental Consulting, knowing that the company was not qualified to perform the assessment. We also have evidence suggesting she bribed or otherwise influenced county officials to push the permit through." Holy hell! It gets better. The FBI is now involved because the problem meadow jumping mouse is federally protected under the Endangered Species Act. Knowingly falsifying environmental studies related to endangered species is a federal crime. Your HOA president is in serious trouble. The news broke publicly the next day. The Denver Post ran a front-page story. "State revokes development permit for Pine Ridge HOA, cites environmental fraud." Local TV news crews showed up in our neighborhood, filming the wetlands and interviewing residents. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, but I declined to comment, referring everyone to the Department of Natural Resources. Brenda tried to control the narrative, issuing a statement claiming the state was overreaching and that the HOA had acted in good faith. But her defense crumbled quickly as more details emerged. Investigative reporters discovered that Green Solutions Environmental Consulting was indeed a shell company, and that its sole environmental consultant was actually Brenda's brother-in-law, a former used car salesman with no environmental training whatsoever. The 12-page environmental study had been copied and pasted from various online sources, with names and locations changed to make it appear site-specific. The forged signature on the permit approval was traced back to Gregory Hunt, the HOA board's lawyer. He had worked with Robert Paulson years ago and apparently kept copies of documents with Paulson's signature, which he then scanned and digitally placed on the fraudulent permit documents. On June 3rd, Boulder County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Brenda's house with an arrest warrant. They also arrested Gregory Hunt and Ronald Hayes, the treasurer who had funneled HOA money to the fake consulting company. Linda Foster, the secretary, was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Apparently, she had been documenting everything, knowing it was illegal but too afraid of Brenda to speak up. The charges were extensive: forgery, fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement of HOA funds, and violations of state environmental protection laws. The federal charges for Endangered Species Act violations were still being developed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I watched from my front window as deputies led Brenda out of her house in handcuffs. She was screaming about how this was all a misunderstanding, how she was being persecuted, how she would sue everyone involved. Her Escalade sat in the driveway, gleaming white and perfect, a symbol of the privilege and entitlement that had led her to believe she could break whatever laws stood in her way. The neighborhood was in shock. Emergency HOA elections were scheduled, and the remaining board members who had not been arrested all resigned. A management company was brought in temporarily to handle basic operations while new leadership was elected. Marcus Chen called me that evening. "You did it. You actually took her down." "I just reported what I found," I said. "She took herself down by breaking the law. Still, this took guts. A lot of people saw what was happening but were too scared to do anything. You were not." The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Brenda, Gregory, and Ronald all pleaded not guilty initially, but as the evidence mounted, they eventually changed their pleas. The federal charges added significant pressure. Violating the Endangered Species Act carried potential prison time and massive fines. In September, Brenda Carmichael pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and environmental law violations. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $230,000 in restitution to the HOA for the embezzled funds. Gregory Hunt received 3 years for his role in forging the permits. Ronald Hayes got 2 years for his part in the financial fraud. The HOA itself faced scrutiny from multiple state agencies. The Colorado Division of Real Estate imposed substantial fines and required the association to undergo governance training and implement new oversight procedures. The Department of Natural Resources required the HOA to fund a comprehensive environmental restoration project for any damage done to the wetlands during the survey and preliminary work. As for me, the new HOA board elected in August dropped all the bogus violations Brenda had filed against me. They also passed a resolution thanking me for exposing the corruption and protecting the community's environmental assets. I was offered a seat on the board, but I declined. I had had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. The wetlands were officially designated as a protected conservation area, with additional state oversight to ensure no future development attempts. The county revised its permit approval processes, to prevent similar fraud, implementing multiple layers of review for any projects involving protected lands. Susan Rodriguez, my attorney, helped me file a civil suit against the HOA for the retaliatory enforcement actions and harassment. The HOA's insurance company settled quickly, not wanting to go to trial and risk a larger judgment. I used the settlement money to fund a scholarship for environmental science students at the University of Colorado Boulder. In November, about 8 months after I first saw those orange survey markers, I stood on my back deck with a cup of coffee, looking out at the wetlands. Fall colors painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and golds. A great blue heron waded through the shallow water, hunting for fish. In the distance, I could hear the distinctive call of sandhill cranes migrating south for the winter. The wetlands were safe. The corruption had been exposed and punished. The rule of law had prevailed, even against someone with money and connections who thought they were above it. Marcus joined me on the deck, carrying his own coffee mug. We had become close friends through all of this, bonded by our shared opposition to Brenda's schemes. "You know what the crazy thing is," Marcus said. "If Brenda had just followed the proper procedures, she probably could have built a community center somewhere else in the neighborhood. There are other locations that do not have environmental restrictions. But she was so fixated on that specific spot and so arrogant about her ability to force things through that she ended up destroying her entire life." "Pride comes before the fall," I said. "She thought the rules did not apply to her. Well, she learned otherwise." 4 years in federal prison is a hard lesson. We sipped our coffee in comfortable silence, watching the wildlife move through the wetlands. The problem meadow jumping mice were out there somewhere, tiny creatures whose protected status had helped bring down an HOA president and expose environmental fraud at the county level. Nature had unlikely defenders, but sometimes that was enough. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Helen Fitzgerald, was the polar opposite of Brenda. She ran meetings democratically, kept meticulous records, and actually listened to homeowner concerns. The neighborhood began to heal from the toxic atmosphere Brenda had created. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other, less worried about petty violations and harassment. I went back to my normal work as an environmental consultant, but my reputation had grown significantly. I was invited to speak at conferences about the importance of environmental due diligence and the dangers of permit fraud. Several environmental advocacy groups reached out, asking me to consult on cases where they suspected similar corruption in other developments. In December, I received an unexpected letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They were awarding me a Citizens Conservation Award for my role in protecting endangered species habitat. The ceremony was held in Denver, and Patricia Morrison was there, along with representatives from various state and federal environmental agencies. "You exemplify what citizens can accomplish when they stand up for environmental protection," the regional director said during his speech. "Your diligence and expertise prevented irreparable harm to critical wetland habitat and helped expose corruption in the permit process. This award recognizes not just what you did, but your courage in doing it despite personal harassment and retaliation." I accepted the award, gave a brief speech thanking everyone who had supported the investigation, and tried not to think too much about how strange this all was. A year ago, I had been a guy who just wanted to drink his coffee and not deal with HOA drama. Now, I was receiving federal awards for environmental protection. Life has a funny way of working out sometimes. The civil trial against the county officials who had been negligent or complicit in the permit fraud took place in early 2027. While I was not directly involved, I was called as an expert witness to explain the deficiencies in the environmental study and why any competent reviewer should have caught them. The county ended up settling with several plaintiffs, including environmental groups and the state, paying out substantial damages and agreeing to major reforms in their permitting process. 3 county employees were fired, including the department head who had overseen the permits division. The county hired new leadership and brought in outside consultants to audit their entire environmental review system. It was a painful but necessary house cleaning. Through all of this, the Pine Ridge community itself grew stronger. The scandal had been embarrassing, but it had also galvanized residents to pay more attention to HOA governance and to demand transparency and accountability. Meeting attendance increased dramatically. People actually read the minutes and reviewed the financial statements. The rubber stamp era of HOA management was over one afternoon in late January, almost a year after this all began. Dorothy, the elderly woman who had been afraid to speak up about the wetlands, knocked on my door. She was carrying a plate of homemade cookies. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, "for having the courage to do what the rest of us could not. I was so worried about losing those wetlands. My husband and I used to walk down there every evening before he passed away. Those trails and that natural space are precious." "You do not need to thank me," I said, accepting the cookies. "I just did what was right." "That is exactly why I am thanking you. Doing what is right is not always easy, especially when powerful people are doing wrong. You stood up anyway." After she left, I sat on my couch eating cookies and reflecting on the past year. It had been stressful, occasionally frightening, and completely exhausting, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Some things were worth fighting for: environmental protection, rule of law, community integrity, basic honesty and decency. Brenda Carmichael had tried to steamroll over all of those things in pursuit of her vanity project. She had lied, cheated, stolen, and bullied her way forward, assuming nobody would stop her. She was wrong. The system had worked eventually. It required citizens willing to use that system, to file the complaints, to dig through the documents, to refuse to be intimidated. But when those citizens stood up, the system had responded. The state had investigated. Law enforcement had acted. The courts had rendered justice. It was not perfect. It took too long. Too many people had been afraid to speak up earlier. The corruption had been allowed to fester for years before it was finally exposed. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. I looked out my window at the wetlands, now protected by multiple layers of state and federal oversight. Construction equipment would never scar that landscape. Native grasses would continue to wave in the wind. Endangered mice would continue to hop through the vegetation. Herons and cranes and songbirds would continue to find refuge there. And homeowners in Pine Ridge estates would continue to enjoy backing up to pristine open space, never knowing how close it had come to being destroyed by an HOA president who thought rules were for other people. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Beer tonight." New HOA board approved a community garden project on that empty lot by the playground. Actual proper permits and everything. I smiled and texted back. "Sounds good. I will bring the documents to review." Old habits died hard. But given what we had been through, a little extra vigilance seemed entirely appropriate. The HOA was under new management, but that did not mean we could afford to be complacent. Democracy, whether at the national level or in a homeowners association, required constant attention from engaged citizens. I grabbed my jacket and headed out for an evening walk through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the mountain views spectacular in the fading winter light. This was a good place to live, made better by the fact that its residents had proven willing to fight for what mattered when the moment came. The Pine Ridge scandal had made headlines for months, but eventually the news cycle moved on. For those of us who lived through it, though, the lessons remained fresh. We had learned what could happen when unchecked power met insufficient oversight. We had seen how quickly corruption could take root when people looked the other way. And we had discovered that ordinary citizens, armed with determination and a willingness to use the tools of transparency and accountability, could make a real difference. As I walked past Brenda's old house, now occupied by a young family who had bought it at a foreclosure auction, I thought about how dramatically things could change in a short time. A year ago, Brenda had been the untouchable queen of Pine Ridge, feared by everyone, answerable to no one. Now she was federal inmate number 47,382-013, serving her sentence at a minimum security facility in Texas. Her reputation destroyed, her freedom gone. Pride really did come before the fall. And when you built your kingdom on lies and fraud, the fall was particularly spectacular. I completed my walk and headed home, looking forward to that beer with Marcus and whatever the future held for our now properly managed homeowners association. The wetlands were safe. Justice had been served. And life in Pine Ridge estates went on, better and more honest than before. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes doing the right thing makes a difference. Sometimes one person with evidence and determination can stop corruption in its tracks. This was one of those times, and I was grateful to have been part of it, even if I had never asked for or expected any of it when I first saw those orange survey markers on that Tuesday morning back in March. The environmental consultant in me was satisfied that the wetlands were protected. The citizen in me was satisfied that criminals had been held accountable. And the homeowner in me was satisfied that our HOA was finally functioning the way it was supposed to, transparently, democratically, and legally. As I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, I took one last look back at the wetlands. The setting sun cast golden light across the water, and I could see the silhouettes of birds settling in for the night. It was beautiful and peaceful and exactly as it should be. And it would stay that way, protected by law and defended by citizens who refused to let corruption win. That was worth celebrating, worth remembering, and worth fighting for again if the need ever arose. But for now, it was time for that beer and some good conversation with a friend who had stood beside me when things got difficult. The battles were over. The good guys had won, and the Pine Ridge wetlands would remain wild and protected for generations to come. That was enough. That was everything